Before we proceed with the behind the scenes, this includes both part 1 and 2 to Dragon Egg. If you would like to watch the parts individually, then part 2 starts at this time. There are a few points repeated across both parts, however, I did minimize this. Anyway, on with the video. Hello everyone, my name is Mont and I am the director for Dragon Egg. This is actually a 2-part animation, so there will be a few things I'll be saving for the next one. However, let's jump straight into things. Starting way back at the beginning, production started way back in late September after my previous animation released, Play vs Piglin. When I first started brainstorming, I wanted to create a short 4 to 5 minute story to hopefully have done by the end of the year in 2021. Around this time I had a lot of different animation ideas, some of which I still want to do. The animation that stood out for me after a bit was a dragon-based animation where an egg is brought into the overworld and is raised by a young caring character. However, as you can tell by now, what was going to be a short animation ended up turning into a nearly 14-minute animation when layouts were finally completed. I had around this time a lot of project deadline problems since before I did layouts, I was planning for it to be done by the end of last year. However, after a lot of discussions and revisions, the decision was made to split the animation in two and release them separately, allowing for me to have a semi-decent release. After I split the animation, I still felt a lot of the story and the layouts lacked, so even after time, it's gotten longer and longer since I keep adding in more moments to expand on things. Overall, this is what came to be the layout for the animation, becoming a slow-paced animation to allow breathing room while still providing some tense moments with the fight at the start and tension at the end. What happens in part 2 though? Guess you have to wait and see how it was split. So a basic overview of the story since I've discussed the process of it. We follow a young shepherd female named Lone, who cares and teaches a newly hatched ender dragon who tries to avoid Steve and the village in fear of taking him away or causing harm. The egg in which was initially found by Steve in a stronghold, how it got there will be found out later. Character-wise, Lone was designed to be a very caring and independent character who can still hold their own and fight. Lone spends her days and nights taking care of her sheep, even as she lives in the barn. She's companions with an Iron Golem friend who helps fends off creatures at night, who is also a very protective character of her while still showing a softer side with flowers. Steve doesn't appear very often in this part, acting as an overseer to this village. Why will hopefully be more apparent later as well. I do have to admit Alex won't be showing up much even in part 2. In terms of maps, I was able to get everything to remain within the Alex and Steve world. I ended up finding an old village between the Steve and Alex house and the village that Thomas used in Save the Village, and I decided to recreate that village I had in mind. Most of the buildings were kept to a very similar building style to the other one, most of which I just was able to copy over. I redid a lot of the paths and terraformed it to be to my liking, before following a tutorial on a cool barn I liked. I spruced up the area a bit, added some little lakes, added a giant lake where I knew I wanted them to train later in the animation, and that concluded the main area. I knew I wanted the animation to open in a stronghold, and I wanted them to come out into a valley with only one way to go, forcing them through the mobs in the opening fight. Since 1.18 wasn't actually out yet, I ended up using World Painter and some World Edit to shape this long valley, trying to somewhat replicate the 1.18 mountains to my liking. I then found a stronghold, used World Edit to bring it over, and ended up taking some inspiration for the portal room, since strongholds are pretty flat structures. Back up on the surface, I knew I wanted a crowded area to cover up where the egg ends up teleporting to, so I built this custom cave with a jungle blocking most of it while still exposing the iron that Lone needs to mine to help heal the golem. Again, making use of the 1.17 and 18 blocks. I tried to keep some nice areas open to allow for some nice ambience. It also allows for decent room to move. After all that, there were still a few assets I needed to produce. I wanted Lone to have a cool custom staff that works well as a stick, staff, and a weapon to grab things. Speaking of Lone, I also designed the skin itself. I took elements from other skins and templates, a lot from other elven type characters with raggy as clothes, and combining them with elements from mine and other medieval animated skins to get to the final result, which I was pretty happy with since I haven't done a lot of skin designing in the past. There were also a few other smaller things with rig adjustments in both the Golem and Ender Dragon, in particular adding more face controls. With everything prepared and worlds now imported into Blender, I did all the layouts across the first few months, while then running into the splitting animation problem, and then finally being able to get into animation. It was really only at the end of December 2021 when I was properly able to get into animation. By the end of that month, I decided to hire a few other awesome animators to help push the project along. So for the first time, I set up an application process and got to hiring Zillion, who did the openings fight, Titan Berserk, who did the first section of the training, and Instinct, who I called them online by, all of which were given a minute's worth of animation to take and do the foreground animation for. It was a pretty good experience for me to actually direct something for once with other people, as I'm used to doing nearly everything myself. I did also record some references for them for the first time ever doing so, which was kind of funny, along with the constant feedback as they worked on their scenes. For myself, I began going through the rest of the 5 minutes of animation left. I was able to start off pretty strong in January, getting scene 2, the longest scene, done in pretty quick time. Things did slow down over time, which is pretty common for me, but this is the most consistent I've been with the project so far. Animation wise, most of it is pretty straightforward, so I'll jump to the key moments to talk about. The dragon was one key area to this animation, being a more complicated creature with more bones to animate, but since speedrun, I've been looking for more opportunities to animate dragons as I think they're very unique to animate. I was able to give the dragon, which has remained nameless for a while, I still need to name it. I swear by the time this animation actually releases, I'll have a name. I'm recording this months in advance. Regardless, I was able to give him a slightly derpy nature as he learns the ropes of, well, living, stumbling around everywhere, even dragging his body around when he first hatches. I did not end up using a lot of loops with the dragon. 99% was pretty custom animated, which in itself made things take much longer, but I felt was worth it. Trying to give life to how weight shifted, giving constant movement to the wings and head. Similarly, I tried to give the Iron Golem an interesting animation style. I wanted to go for a very robotic and rusty style, always moving and stopping abruptly and having heavy steps, which I considered into his walking. The Iron Golem, who if I have to name would be Ben or Benson, ended up being my favourite thing to animate actually. Most of the animation was pretty straightforward process for me at this point though, making sure weight is shifting properly and trying to have slight subtle movements where needed. Even just having small head darts from side to side I find helps immensely. A lot of constraints were used again though, like having the dragon's head follow an object instead so it's not influenced by the rest of the body. By the time I got to the stage of doing faces in mid-February, Sophie had just released a new version of the BPS rig, which had a lot of cool new face features. So I made sure to make use of them instantly, trying to be more expressive using the extra eyebrow controls and so on. Again using teeth, which a lot of people probably aren't a fan of, but personally, with smooth mouths, I feel Toothless just looks like gums. By about mid-March, animation was done. The hired animated scenes had also been taken back, I polished them and had faces done on them. It was time to finally get into lighting and effects. I wanted to give myself a good 2 weeks to go through everything. In the past I would typically rush lighting in like a few days, since animation would take so long. But for once I gave myself time, which I believe resulted in my best lighting by far. I started by doing some research and taking a look at some of the other directors' scenes, trying to understand how mist spheres work, that and trying to expand how I use HDRIs. Both of which I now have a really good understanding and collection of. I left most of the really complex scenes involving rain and thunder until last. I started by doing the simpler scenes which involve daylight. Outside scenes typically can get away with just a sun lamp around a strength of 5 to 7, and I would normally have the angle change each shot. While unrealistic, it allows me to pick the best angles to get nice contrast. When it came to doing inside and cave lighting, most of it is making use of some natural light from lanterns and glowberries. Character lighting then relies mostly on spotlights, which are keyframed each shot to light the face and body of characters. I went for a very high contrast approach by having the characters lit much brighter than the background. As another touch, I had a few spotlights up higher that had a noise node which adds random light which moves over time, makes things feel a little more lively. Over time as I did each scene, I saved off renders into a folder to have a look at the colours across the entire animation. This is something I'm definitely going to be doing more of into the future. I'm just trying to show the production in a more visual way. Lighting for the night and raining scenes had a dimmer sun with a slight blue colour, typically around the value of 0.4. Most of the character light was then brought in by spotlights, similar to the indoor and cave scenes. During the fight scene at the start, I had the lights parented to an object connected to the character which would then follow and rotate around them, which allowed me to keep the lights constantly on them, making them stand out constantly. Visually, the thing that made the difference is the mist. I had the mist much closer to the camera, but didn't have it go as far in the sky, essentially trying to create this low-lying mist which would then be moved quickly over time, like as if it's moving. Whew, now I can talk about effects. So of course, we have the rain. A lot of what I did took visual inspiration from David's rain scenes. I was able to take certain elements like the rain particles and reference a lot of mist depth to try and get a similar result. I used the wet ground nodes to make the ground wet from the rain. During the time lapse, the water also starts to disappear over time. The lightning is partly a BPS asset, so it's not up to me to show much on it, but a few adjustments I made while looking at lighting references was having it collapse into a single beam once it hits the ground, as this is actually how lightning in real life behaves. I was still hoping to give myself a little more time to make these look more realistic, but I was starting to run out of time, so that's something I'm hoping to explore next animation. I had a few custom effects for when the lightning actually impacts the ground and scorches it as well. While I'm not super happy with it, one of the more interesting effects was the grazing after the egg teleports at the end. I started learning a bit about dynamic paint for this animation. One of the things was having the particles from the teleport paint a glowing texture on the ground. Something that I've lacked in the past is having dynamic interactions from animation to the rendered result. Continuing on dynamic paint, I also had objects actually influence the water using wave dynamic paints. I can leave different tutorial links inside the main file linked in the description of different things I referred to if anyone is interested to see where I got tips from. A lot of other effects are ambience particles drifting around using particle systems that emit from the volume, emitting both little embers, and the new particles that emit from spore blossoms. There are a lot of other little effects like the Iron Golem being healed, which use gradients to have a material appear and disappear, an egg that is cracked and bright on the inside, and a few other smaller ones. But that about wraps effects up. Oh wait, the time lapse. I spent an entire day working on the time lapse, mainly bringing in assets from previous scenes to transition between scenes. The mobs themselves were animated every few frames to move, hold, and repeat, disappearing every time day approaches, minus the creepers and spiders. I had one of the zombies actually survive by going to a tree as day approaches each time, which I thought was funny. The time lapse has a story. Although that same zombie does get yeeted by the golem next scene anyway. It's kinda sad. Visually, I picked different times of day, picked out different HDRIs, different mist colours, and essentially just had it fade between all of them, which produced some nice colours when fading between some of them, particularly from sunset to night, since there's a difference in the actual gradient between them. I also had the stars rotate during the night like the Earth is rotating. Coming into the final week, it was a sprint to get everything done by my deadline. It was now just a matter of rendering, editing, bloopers, behind the scenes, and thumbnails. This is being recorded late March, so the only thing left for me is thumbnails. Then it's on to part 2, which will be done before you see this anyway. There's still a lot to be revealed in the second part. I hope everyone enjoyed the first for now and are excited for more. I'm really happy with how this one turned out. It is my favourite so far from animations that I've made. While there are still a lot of things I would still love to change and spend more time in, it turned out really nice, and hoping to continue this into part 2. The other animators did a great job on their scenes as well. Many thanks go to them as well. But for now, that's it from me. See you all very soon for part 2, and I'll be back with another behind the scenes for it to explain more things. See you guys later. Hello everyone, my name is Mont, and I am the director for Dragon Egg: The Storm, otherwise part 2 for the first Dragon Egg. Being a 2-part animation, if you missed the first behind the scenes, then make sure to watch that along with the animation first. Let's jump into things. This project had a bit of a jumpy start. As I mentioned last behind the scenes, this was split into parts mid-project. So while production started way back in late September of 2021 for the layouts, I didn't get around to actually starting animating for this project until the start of April this year. So excluding the strange start, I've spent a total of 3 months on part 2, since this was finished in the first few days of July. In total, both animations have totaled up to around 18 minutes of animation, with roughly 6 minutes being handed off to other animators, the rest done by myself. Like I mentioned last time, this was originally going to be a short 4 to 5 minute animation, so to see where it ended up is actually pretty ridiculous. Again, I went over a decent amount of details in regards to splitting the project last behind the scenes, so check that out. Now that both the parts are out, I can reveal more to the story. We open up in the end with Steve and Alex taking on the Ender Dragon. This is well before the events of Dragon Egg, which is set up in the opening scene that the 11-eyed portal actually foreshadows. This helps set up Steve's distrust towards the dragons, having himself experience people die around him. We then follow the young shepherd female named Lone, along with her dragon named Flynn, as they grow up. After being discovered but redeemed and allowed to stay in the village due to the dragon's actions, Flynn continues to grow up, attempting to help as he does. Over time, his size starts to become a nuisance before getting defensive towards a provocative player after causing some damage. Again being redeemed as he comes in to save people during a storm, being allowed to stay in the overworld in which the village helps prepare the original cave for him to stay in. A quick mention, this was originally going to be part of a mini-series which no longer will really happen. So to answer why we don't really see Alex, it mostly answers that, as we would have explored what Alex is up to if I continued this. However, in saying that, we will continue to see Lone and Flynn, so their story is not over yet. We are yet to see what all this lightning stuff is about. Post-release Mont here, I did just want to mention there was honestly little to no intentional inspiration or copying of How to Train Your Dragon here. Looking back, I wish I hadn't have directed these few shots in particular to be so gosh dang similar. Apologies if this ruined the experience for anyone, but this wasn't intentional. While not an inspiration for this project specifically, my love for dragons has come pretty heavily from Smaug in The Hobbit.
What will you do now, Bowman?
Although dragons are overall pretty awesome. Back to old Mont. I covered most of the pre-production last time, including characters and maps, although a few quick mentions. For the end, if anything, I actually got a bit lazy and used the end map I used for speedrun, although I ended up removing the 2 cages to do the trident effect. We also see an end version to the dragon cave later on when Flynn moves in. Okay, moving on. Like last time, I'll skip to any worthwhile mentions. I started by giving out a few scenes to the other 2 animators. I had Titan Berserk work on the end of scene 7 and the final scene, and Instinct, who I call them online by, was given the hectic scene 4. I later also contacted them again to do the opening fight since I was short on time. They took their scenes, did the foreground animation, and I later took them back and finished everything up. Make sure to thank them as well and check out their work. Wait, post-release Mont again. Completely forgot to mention, but Scar and Jelly. If you're keen-eyed enough, you may also spot a few more hermit crafters in the background. Scar was actually supposed to just be a temp skin, but near the end of production I felt it was suitable to keep him in since I had no intention of changing Jelly's cat texture. This is actually his cat in case you didn't know him. Scar's a great content creator, so give him some support. Back to old me. As I mentioned last time, the dragon was one of the key areas to this animation, being more complicated along with the habit that creature animation typically is a little more ambitious, since we live in a world of humans, understanding much easier how they move. The challenge with this compared to the first part is animating dragons of different sizes. The smaller dragon is a lot quicker, more energetic, and even though Flynn doesn't grow up to full size by the end of this, the teenage version is still quite fast, but packs more weight. Personally, I feel I could have exaggerated this weight a lot more, since the movements are still very light for the most part, but there's some difference here. Benson the Iron Golem actually got a bit of an upgrade from part 1. Stylistically, he got a lot more robotic in his movements. A while back, I actually saw some footage from Blender Studio as to how they were researching robotic animation, and I started considering this more into my animation, having the movements be more quick, but then reverberate a few times. I'm pretty happy with how it turned out, and ended up being my favourite thing to animate. Again, sticking with the teeth and curved mouth for this animation, I have actually been talking a bit with the other directors in regards to this style, and I will be starting to pull back a bit on the use of teeth in particular. But enjoy or hate it while you can. There were a few other general things I mentioned last behind the scenes, but otherwise, moving on. Similar to the last project, I gave myself a good 2 weeks to do lighting and effects. I'm still very happy with how most of it turned out, so let's take a look. I was able to take the inside, outside, nighttime and cave lighting from all previous scenes from part 1. I talk a lot about these in the previous behind the scenes, but generally speaking I rely very heavily on the sun angle, along with spotlights which follow characters around. If a character is moving around a lot, especially at night, then I will use constraints to have it stay with the rig. In night scenes, I would also try and have the natural light from lamps and the moonlight where I can. Like last time, I saved off renders into a folder and had a look at the colours across the entire animation. Nice way to see how things are progressing overall, and compare things like contrast and brightness over the entire video. Effects. I ended up doing a little more experimenting with the mist again for rainy scenes. I had more visible noise that was stretched to make it feel more like heavy rain is in the background. Paired with the rain particles in rain scenes, this looks decent. Honestly, if I do more rain scenes in the future, I feel I can do a lot better. In the recovery scene, I also played around a bit with vertical mist changes, where low-lying areas were one color, changing as you move up into the sky. Adds a little more to just the horizontal change. For the end start? Opening in the end. Wait. In the end, you know what I mean. We have some pretty heavy mist along with a cool looking HDRI, which has changed since the last time I did end stuff. I had these small purple particles that float around to add a little more ambience to the scene. For lighting, I had a sun around the strength of 3 and spotlights following the key objects each shot. This allowed me to get some decent contrast between foreground and background. I went for a somewhat mid to heavy mist approach. Looking at different references, I've seen good examples of end lighting, some by 1Z and Lord 3009, who went for completely opposite directions for mist. Effects wise, I reused the Enderman teleport effects for Enderman that David made in Songs of War, although I stuck to the basic end particles. For the explosions, it was just the same explosions spammed on each tower that we have as one of our assets. The idea being when one crystal gets destroyed, it damages the dragon, activating the next one and repeating this, essentially causing a lot of damage to the dragon. For the portal, also including the opening, it's a bit of a weird one, but I had a sky texture which had its hue change to green, which I then overlaid some emissive noise textures on top to get this cool moving material. Parts of it were also transparent, in which I then used a sphere gradient to then open and close the portal. Oh yeah, and like in speedrun, the portal room itself is just stuck onto the side of the end. I then just had the mist and sky change as we move through the portal. A quick mention, since no one will actually see this, but for the rain scenes, characters did actually get damp. Some of the other directors pointed out that they were way too glossy and shouldn't be shining that much light. While I could have still created a damp texture without the glossiness, I ended up just removing it overall, but interesting effect. There are a lot of shots with little dirt particles flying from the ground on impacts. These were just simple particle systems which then collided with parts of the world set as collisions. For the ink splatter, I got a lot more experimental here, playing with dynamic paint. I had the squid emit some particles which I then had set as a brush that would paint a black texture onto the ground. I had to spend a while to get this looking good since it also slows down the scene a lot, but I got a good looking pattern that I was happy with and got the material to look like ink. For the crop break, I ended up using a hair simulation which would then be moved by an object with a collision. That way the creatures could run through and destroy the crops. This one gave me some troubles though. I did talk about lightning a bit last time, but I made a few changes. Over time I've only ever used the same lightning shape, which was starting to get a bit boring, particularly for the final storm. I ended up adding a few more paths to it, keeping in mind to look at it from a 3D space, since it was originally designed to be viewed from one angle. We can see a bit of the new version in the dragon saving scene. Speaking of that, we get a few more hints to Lone having some kind of lightning power. I went into Photoshop and mapped out the areas that I wanted to glow and just had this laid on top of the skin. Gave it an appropriate colour and, well, we'll see what happens in the future when we next see Flynn. Quickfire round. I got ambience particles drifting around using particle systems that emit from the volume, emitting both little embers and spore blossoms. I had some burn marks from when the dragon sneezed or breathed. The lightning zaps were actually an old asset that I made a long time ago. I'll see if I can link a tutorial. There'll probably be a few others I forgot, but I'll show them here if so. But that about wraps up effects. The final week was again very hectic, getting through editing, bloopers, thumbnails, and now this behind the scenes. In terms of my own final thoughts to close things out, I'm very happy with how these two animations turned out. Part of me still prefers the first part a little more, although in certain areas like the lighting, music choices, and animation itself I felt a lot better in. I have a habit of being harsh on my own projects since I see all the areas to improve in, although most of us have that. Feel free to share your thoughts on both part 1 and part 2. Let me know what I can improve on, what you liked, your favourite part, and whatnot. But overall, so far the best project I've made, easily. Minus the How to Train Your Dragon part. Once again, I thank the other animators a ton for the work they have done for this project. Make sure to check their work out as well. But for now, that's it from me. Leave your thoughts in the comments and I will see you all next time. Bye!